Hey, this is your Great Lakes dude, Jeff Liskay, coming to you on the Wet Fly Swing podcast, where we're going to be going rage angler on all things Great Lakes, from gear, fly, big water, and swinging flies, of course. If it concerns the Great Lakes, we've got you covered, so stay tuned to this next episode. Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing podcast, Great Lakes. I'm your host, Jeff Liskay, aka Great Lakes Dude. It's been a while since the listeners I've had a podcast, and after around 200 some days of guiding and destination and another grandkiddo born, I'm back at it. I have a great episode for you. Really long-time friend, D'Arcy Egan, long-time outdoor writer for the Cleveland Plain Dealer for over 50 years. I'm super excited to dive into a whole bunch of topics with him, but without further ado, D'Arcy, welcome to the show.
Jeff, it's so good to be with you. You know, we've spent a lot of time together over the years, and I'm talking decades. It's been really an awful lot of fun. But one of the things that an outdoor writer, and that's primarily what I am, I'm an outdoor writer for the Plain Dealer, but I also do radio and television and magazine articles. And one of the things I learned early on, that in order to be able to do what I did and do it well, you have to have the knowledge. You have to know the terminology. You have to hands-on be out there with experts who can show you how much the fun is that we're having out on the rivers, out on the lakes, in the turkey woods, in the deer woods. It doesn't really matter. But you have to know the terminology. You have to know the hows and whys of what we're doing. And, of course, if you do that, you'll also have an incredible amount of fun. And some of the guys that I've had the most fun with are guys like you fishing steelhead trout, because Northeast Ohio is really a mecca. It's a world-class fishery, and you have become one of the icons of steelhead trout fishing in Northeast Ohio.
I guess it comes with just years on the water, right? It doesn't matter, who your mentor is, whatever. Look at all the contacts you've had, Darce, right? It's like unbelievable. Everybody asks me, it's like, if you need to know anything about the outdoors in our area, just contact D'Arcy. Because the contacts you've achieved over all the years, it's like from hunting or fishing too. It's like, oh my gosh, it's unbelievable.
Well, where do you think I learned all that stuff from? I learned it from Mike Spinullo, and I learned it from you, and I learned it from Jerry Darkus, and the good feelings in my heart. I saw a Facebook page the other day from Jerry Darkus, and basically he was posting a picture that I took long ago of his daughter in his lap, 5 years old, tying a fly that she was going to use to catch a fish. And he posted a picture of his granddaughter in his lap, who was 5 years old, tying a fly. It was just generational. It was amazing to even think about that we've both been around for so long.
Yeah, right. Why don't you tell the listeners a little story where you came from, maybe how you got into writing, maybe give a little tip for some of the younger writers that are out there. But why don't you just give us a little background of how you got to Cleveland, huh?
Well, we kind of stutter-stepped down to Cleveland. My dad and mom grew up in Calgary, Alberta, in Western Canada, on the eastern shore of the Canadian Rockies. And it was, my dad was into the hockey business. His father owned a theater in Calgary, the Palace Theater. And my dad did stage shows with his sister, my Aunt June. But my dad also did radio. He broadcast hockey games in Western Canada. My grandfather was really into amateur hockey. In the years before they moved to Calgary, they were in Regina, Saskatchewan, and my grandfather was the president and coach of the Regina Pats Junior A hockey team. And the Regina Pats were the first Western Canada Junior A team to ever win the National Junior A Championship. So my grandfather was a hero in Western Canada. And in 1960, they proclaimed him the Sportsman of the Year in Western Canada.
Wow.
So we were Canadians. My dad was into hockey, and the Cleveland Barons, who he had scouted for and sent players to Cleveland from Western Canada, they wanted to hire my dad because he had hockey broadcasting experience, and very few people in the States were able to do that. So my dad was hired to come to Cleveland to broadcast the Cleveland Barons hockey games on radio and do public relations, which he was that kind of guy. He liked public relations and marketing, and he had stories, and he was just really a popular guy once he moved to Cleveland. And he stopped saying, "Hey, I'm from Canada, eh?" and began to speak Ohioan.
Got it. So when did you come into the whole picture? Was it you were born in Alberta, but then after that, how did it all start? How to get into writing and the outdoors and things like that?
Well, my dad didn't quickly bring all of us down to Cleveland. I arrived when I was about 6, 7 years old. And when we got to Cleveland, I was just a normal kid. The neighborhood kids looked at me kind of funny because I said, "A?" And they said, "A what?" And so, out and about was still in my vocabulary. But I discovered that I really liked fishing. And I had a couple of neighbors when I got to be 11 or 12 years old that would take me down to Lake Erie to fish for yellow perch. And they were older guys, and it wasn't very often, but my part of the job of going along and being, getting to areas that I couldn't get to as a kid, my job was to scale perch when we got them home. And so I had a kind of like a thumb depressor with two bottle caps nailed to the top, and I would scale perch, and I learned to fillet perch and stuff like that. And my mom, coming from Western Canada, had rarely had fresh Lake Erie perch, ever. And so she was pretty kicked off. She loved that her son, who was 10, 11, 12 years old, bringing home fresh perch for dinner. But I really began to love it. And when I was young, one of the things that my folks did was my dad broadcast for a short period of time the Cleveland Indians baseball team. And he had sports radio shows. And Clay Dopp, who broadcast the Indians back in the 1950s, had a cottage over at Euclid Beach Park. And you may not remember Clay Dopp, but you will remember Mr. Jingling, because Clay Dopp's wife was the play lady. But they would take me in for a few weeks in the summertime, and once you've ridden all the rides at Euclid Beach, it got pretty boring. So I would go down to the pier with the old timers, and they would show me how to catch yellow perch, and they would show me how to catch sheephead and catfish, and the blue pike were already gone. They were extinct, just about, but they would become extinct. And walleye, there weren't any. But I learned to fish, and I started to ride the bus from the Cleveland Zoo area of Cleveland down to Ridgewood Lake, in now where Palmertown Mall is, and I would fish for catfish and bluegills, or I would take a bus all the way down State Road, West 25th Street, down to the lake, and I would either walk to Edgewater Park or walk to East 9th Street and fish for perch.
Oh, the old Captain's Franks.
Old Captain Frank's, and we would sit on the pier, and there were an awful lot of guys that would come down every day and fish, and those are the guys that I learned how to catch perch. And we did weird things back then, like rubber band fishing, where you'd use a rubber band and you'd make a long cast, and you would leave the rubber band attached to your line. So you would bring in the fish, and then when you took the fish off the hook, you would open the bail, and the rubber band, being all stretched, would go back to its normal position right where you caught that last fish.
What was the weight? How much was the weight on the end of the rubber band?
The weight on the end of the rubber band was usually a railroad spike.
So I mean, you threw it out there.
You threw it out there.
Oh,
oh yes. But it was a hoot, and that's began my love of fishing. And I really started to travel a little bit to go fishing. And when I got married early. I was 19 years old, and at 21 had two of the prettiest daughters you'd ever imagine. And I started to my newspaper career right out of high school. I worked for the old Parma Post, which became the Parma Sun News eventually. And then that was my first daily newspaper job was the Coshocton, Ohio Tribune. I was the sports editor. And I left there after about a year and went to the Medina County Gazette as the managing editor. And I started working part-time at the Plain Dealer. And eventually I worked my way onto the Plain Dealer.
And that's 50 some years ago, correct?
Oh, yeah. Well, Lou Gale was the outdoors editor back then. And I thought to myself, that would be my dream job. That really would. And back in 1976, my dad died, unfortunately, and he was the publicity director and marketing director at Northfield Park. And I was working there part-time because I had to feed my family. And he had a heart attack in 76 and died. So Carl Milstein, who owns Northfield Park, called me and wanted me to replace my dad. And I said, well, I don't know. I was full-time at the Plain Dealer, good pay and all that type of thing. And he threw a number at me that I couldn't resist. And so I took it, and I did it for a year. And I realized that it wasn't really for me. And so I had quit, and not knowing what I'd do next. But Hal Lebovitz, who was the Plain Dealer sports editor and a good friend and mentor, Hal Lebovitz called me and he said, hey, I know you wanted the outdoors job. Well, Lou Gale just walked out of my office. He just retired, and you better get down here today. And I did. And I was the first of about 175 people that wanted the job. And so I thought, well, this is going to be a good one. But I had enough friends and I had enough mentors at the Plain Dealer that I got it. And it's been my dream job for decades and decades. And I have to thank Hal Lebovitz for making sure that I got that job. And, it's been it really has been a dream job because I've been able to travel everywhere. And back in the day, we had a travel budget, which was really good. So I could go to Canada 3 or 4 times a year and really find myself in places that fly-in trips, that places nobody had ever been to, ever before.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember just how many hundreds of people would come to me and wait for your articles to come out. It was like, because the resources that you gave the local fishery here, from fly fishing to conventional gear fishing, it was just like, oh, it's, your fishing reports, and then your reports is like, because we didn't have the technology back then. It was in print, and you were the one giving the local anglers the information. Now they pick up their cell phone, a couple boops later, they're like, oh, I go here, I do this. But how was it like when you first got here, and as you're working through before that, when you were younger, how was the conservation issue? Was it still like really the pollution and everything was just starting to get better, or where was it at there as far as like all like the Cuyahoga River out in the lake? How was it?
Well, we're spoiled right now. There is no doubt about it. When I began with I'll tell you a perfect example. When I began in 1978 as the outdoors editor of the Plain Dealer, one of the stories that I did was about the 3 sets of nesting eagles in all of Ohio. Now, this DDT back in the old days, in World War II, was used as a pesticide. And it killed so many things, but it was a poison. And the eagles disappeared in Ohio. And so did cormorants. And children got sick. What they were doing, they were dusting in northwest Ohio, dusting the marshes with DDT to kill the mosquitoes, because you couldn't live in those areas because of the mosquitoes and the black flies and everything. So DDT was used early and often until Rachel Carson in 1962 published her book. And basically that did it. Now, Rachel Carson was a great writer. I'm trying to remember the name of her book. But anyway, it described the evils of DDT. And DDT was banned. Silent Spring was the name of her book, The Silent Spring. And that's because DDT killed so many much of our wildlife. We didn't realize it was gone until all of a sudden one spring we said, where is everything? Where are all the warblers? Where are all the eagles? Where are all this wildlife? Where's it gone? Well, that's where it had gone. So in 1962, she wrote the book. They soon banned DDT. And the next thing you knew, you were starting to see some of it come back. But it was slow and steady because there was so much DDT residue all around. Now, in 1978, I wrote about those 3 eagle nests because that's all that there were in the state of Ohio. The Buckeye State was in trouble. Now, in 2020 was the last census of eagles in Ohio. There were 707 eagle nests from Lake Erie to the Ohio River.
Wow.
It was amazing. Today, when I was leaving the house on Marblehead, Ohio, I saw 2 eagles from the east-west highway going down to Route 2 to come here. 2 eagles flying. One had some kind of small rodent in its mouth. The other had a twig, meaning they're building a nest.
So we have that comeback story. We have the walleye comeback story. But let's backtrack. We chat a little bit before, is probably your generation of how DuPont and the story of the Cuyahoga River when it first started on fire, but how the commercial fishery really started, and the downfalls of how we interjected with when the DuPont company invented the net. That was a great story you told me.
Well, you're talking about 2 or 3 different stories,
Yeah.
and what most people don't realize, they didn't know, but if they look at the records and they look at the past experts of the 50s, they can realize what happened to Lake Erie and why was it the mistake on the lake in Cleveland. Well, pollution had something to do with it. There was no doubt about that. But Lake Erie was still a very fertile lake. We had guys like Glenn Lau out in Toledo who became a real icon of the outdoor industry and the film industry. His film Big Mouth was an exceptional film on largemouth bass. We had all kinds of people out there that knew Lake Erie was a really great lake, but it had been abused. The commercial fishing industry at the time had used the fish down method when they caught fish. And they caught fish with trap nets, they caught fish with seine nets, but more importantly, they caught fish with gill nets. And a gill net back in the 40s wasn't all that much of a problem. It was a problem, but not that much, because they were cotton or linen nets, creosoted, so they wouldn't rot when they were put in the water. And so you had to pull those nets every couple of days, dry them out, or they would quickly rot. So if you were going to use them all summer long, that was the system. Now, during World War II, DuPont invented nylon, and nylon translated into monofilament line, which did not rot like the regular gill nets would. So they could use monofilament line to manufacture their gill nets, which were far more efficient because they were less visible to the fish, and they would catch every fish that swam through them. So anyway, you can go back in the records and you can see from the early 1950s up until the early 60s, you can see the commercial harvest of Lake Erie fish skyrocket. And we were shipping carloads of fish from Lake Erie, from walleye to perch to white bass to carp to you name it, all over the country. And restaurants were booming selling Lake Erie fish. But what happens if you take too many of them? Or in some cases, take almost all of them, like the blue pike. They disappear. And now the blue pike, which was really popular in the 60s, they had a restaurant on 9th Street in Cleveland named the Blue Pike Cafe. The blue pike not only just disappeared, it became extinct.
We do a really good job as humans, don't we?
But it was an amazing happening. But back then, and I can attest to this, not many people had boats. There were small boats being made in Sandusky. The Lyman Boat Works made a lot of money. The Lyman Boat Works, when they started making boats in the late 1800s, early 1900s, made huge boats, huge sailboats and huge power boats. But then they really ran out of that market. And what they did was they moved to Sandusky, Ohio, and started making affordable 16 and 20 and 24-foot boats, wooden boats. And they were so popular that people were buying them. But still, there were still very few boats on Lake Erie and very few fishermen on Lake Erie that were going out in boats. Well, when fiberglass came along and aluminum came along, that changed. All of a sudden, we've got more boats on Lake Erie, we've got more people fishing, and we've got an industry, after we bought out the gill nets, that was starting to blossom. Now, it didn't blossom in the 60s. It just started in the 60s. And by the time we got into the 70s, we began to see that what would happen if we allowed walleye to spawn instead of gill netting them in April and May.
Well, and that's when my generation, I started fishing is in the 70s, and it was just taking off, so I didn't see the bad of the worst. But then it just kept getting from the 70s to the 80s. It just kept I think 84 was was unbelievable walleye boom too. So if you let Mother Nature do its thing, right?
Yep.
It does its thing. You wouldn't happen to know how much that Lyman cost back then, would you?
Oh, golly, no, I don't.
Yeah. Like $400 maybe? I don't know.
Probably $400 or $500.
Yeah.
And they made some really small boats, little 14-footers as well, and things like that. But they were great boats. My wife, Laura, when she was working her way through college, she worked her way through college as a Lake Erie fishing guide in the summertime. Her parents owned Channel Grove Marina, and Laura was a good fisherman, and she bought a 26-foot Lyman, open Lyman, and she went out there fishing, and she laughed because all of her friends were working at fast food restaurants or McDonald's and that type of thing for $4 an hour. And she was running trips for $400 a day. So she worked her way through college and on her own as a charter guide, and she was quite the charter guide. She drew attention to it from a lot of people, and the only ones that wouldn't book her were the Amish fishermen.
Huh?
Because their wives didn't like them going out on the water with this girl in cut-off jean shorts, that type of thing. But Laura had a lot of fun charter fishing, and she was very good at it. And she still today, when we go out on the water, she'll point out something that we missed on Gull Shoal. We should have drifted over the top of Gull over there. So, she is still pretty acknowledges, all of what she's known about Lake Erie over the years.
Besides her, you were a charter boat captain too. Your resume gets pretty long.
Well, I ran charter trips because I enjoyed it, and it really was an awful lot of fun. But it was really, at the time, I had a big mortgage, and I had 2 kids, and I thought, we got to be doing something on the weekends to be able to make a few more bucks. And the fishery was coming back. And because I did fishing reports every week, because I talked to the people all over Lake Erie every week, I knew where the fishing was good. And if I had mentioned guys in my fishing report or in my columns in the Plain Dealer, they felt obligated to make sure that I knew where the good fishing was, both for my fishing reports and for me and for them.
Yeah, I mean, knowledge is king, right? Now we go and research and text messaging, but back then it was like pretty much a small village of who was in your marina. And like, of course, you had hundreds of, people that read your articles and stuff like that. But maybe let's shift gears a little bit and we'll tell a funny story. So it's not funny, but it's a long time story. I think, can you remember back the first time that we spent all day on the river steelhead fishing?
Oh, I think that was with Mike Spanulo and you, and we had fished over on the Chagrin River, and we decided to go for the big fish over on Elk Creek.
And how many people did we see back then?
None.
Right.
It was amazing. And this was the beginning. And you guys, it wasn't a secret, but it was, no one realized that they had the beginning of a world-class fishery.
Right? No one. I think we put, the ODNR, they stocked a few fish. It was the King Salmon and Co. start, first. But remember, it's like, I think everybody's like they put the cart before the horse, right?
Oh, there's no doubt about it.
And I really remember it was like, this is a great fishery. And it's like, you're looking around and there's no one there. And it took 20 some years.
Well, it did. It took an awful long time. And the Division of Wildlife really just didn't have it together because when they began, they stocked coho salmon. Now, what the heck? I mean, we didn't know any better, but they certainly didn't know any better either. Coho salmon were fish that were going to go out, grow large enough, come back, spawn, and die. And then they began with Chinook salmon. And everybody loved Chinook because they were big salmon. They were big fish. But the Chinook, when they came in on the Chagrin River at Daniels Park Dam, when they hit the dam, they couldn't go any further. So the only way you could catch them was snagging them or just watch them die because they were spawning fish. Now, the steelhead trout, the first effort at steelhead trout was a rainbow trout that they kind of morphed into a steelhead trout. It did go out on Lake Erie, it did come back, but it didn't come back in the numbers that it should have. When they went to a real wild steelhead trout that they got from Michigan, now we got a different fish. Now we've got a steelhead trout that not only goes out to Lake Erie and feeds all summer long and gets big, it comes to spawn and then goes back out to feed again and get bigger. And then it comes back in the next year and you can catch them. And most of the guys that fish for steelhead trout are like you. They're sportsmen. They enjoy the thrill of catching a steelhead trout, but they realize that releasing most of the fish they catch is the right thing to do to maintain this fantastic, classic steelhead trout fishery.
Yeah. If you're not just listening right now, this is the Wet Fly Swing podcast with Jeff Liskay as your host. And my guest today is D'Arcy Egan, and we're reminiscing some old time stories. He's telling us about the fisheries, and I'm interjecting with some stories of my own. But thanks for the listening. And what's interesting, D'Arcy, is that back then, did you ever think, and I didn't think, that this fishery would explode this much as it has now, how it's grown? I mean, I knew it would take some time, but it's been way over 20 years. It's been over 40 years now. So it's like,
yep.
What do you think? Do you think it ever would be where it was, where you had the Cuyahoga River being stocked with steelhead and to keep the numbers? Do you think it would ever happen like this?
I never did. I truthfully never did. I went through the years of the salmon stockings and knew that wasn't going to be what we really wanted to do. Now, but one thing that changed the whole complexion of the steelhead fishery was we knew that we had to get those wild steelhead from Michigan and Wisconsin to be able to raise them and stock them. And let's go back to first Mayor, Governor, and Senator George Voinovich.
Absolutely.
And George Voinovich, Steve Maywell and I had taken George Voinovich out fishing a number of times. And Maydwell was the director of the Lake County Metro Parks at the time and would go on to be the director of the Toledo Metro Parks. Maydwell was the real prodding entity with George Voinovich. And we fished with George, and he loved perch fishing on Lake Erie. He was an angler. We prodded George as best we could. When the Castelia Fish Hatchery went up for sale, we told him he had to buy it. He had to buy that hatchery because if we could propagate steelhead trout there, if we could get the fingerlings in and raise them to 8-9 inches in length as yearlings and stock them in the rivers, they would survive. The fingerlings didn't survive. If the seagulls didn't get them, the walleye did. And so when the Castalia fish hatchery went up for sale, Voinovich told the head of his Department of Natural Resources to buy the Castalia fish hatchery. Well, it got sold, but not to the state of Ohio. And Madewell and I were not happy, and especially Steve. And other people really didn't understand why we should be so upset. Well, George Voinovich, now the senator, at that time was the governor, George Voinovich apologized. And a couple of years later, the hatchery went up for sale because the people that bought it just really couldn't support it. It needed a lot of repairs and work. So anyway, George Voinovich called Madewell, and he called me, and he said, guess what I did today? I said, okay, what did you do today, Governor? And he said, I bought the Castalia fish hatchery. It was a grand day. And now here's the problem with that steelhead. It's not a problem, but here's what I know about that steelhead trout fishery. That steelhead trout fishery is excellent. That's number one. Number two, it gives us more than 20 miles of the Rocky River and more than 20 miles of the Chagrin River, not counting all the other rivers that are stocked with steelhead trout. It gives them, those rivers are free and open for everyone to fish. Everyone. Doesn't matter if you're coming from Sweden or Timbuktu or West Virginia. You can come and fish those rivers. They're open. There are no fishing signs, number one. And number two, if you want to buy a one-day license in the state of Ohio to go fishing, and again, it doesn't matter where in the world you are or where you're coming from, it's $14. Now, come on. That is the most economical steelhead trout fishing in the world.
Right. I can't believe it myself. I think it might be going up a slight bit more now, but it's nothing like the other states. But I heard the word when the governor was getting ready to buy the hatchery. They were recommended he didn't do it. And his exact words were, you weren't listening. I said, buy it. Like they were like, oh, so without that, I think we'd be back to our one London hatchery. I don't think it'd be so successful for sure. But so we're moving on. We got this hatchery. We got this great fishery that's all around. So what do you think about this stocking the Cuyahoga? What's your thoughts on that? And like you grew up on Big Creek, a tributary of it.
You know, I did. And when we moved to Cleveland, my mom rented a house on West 24th Street in Broadview. And it overlooked Big Creek, which runs past the Cleveland Zoo. And it wasn't a nice place. There were slaughterhouses down there in the valley. There's a bridge over it, of course, that separates Pearl Road from West 25th Street. And we used to call it the Brooklyn Bridge. I think they still do. And there was a YMCA on the far side. But we used to play down there. And we were forbidden, which we did anyway, we were forbidden to even wade in Big Creek because there was a paint and wallpaper factory on the bank of Big Creek. And it was just one of the many polluters of Big Creek. And so you never knew what color Big Creek would be each day because you didn't know what kind of effluent the paint and wallpaper factory would pump into the river. So you could have a red river, a green river, a blue river one day, but nothing could live in there. There were no crayfish, there were no fish, there was nothing that could live in Big Creek, and Big Creek flowing right into the Cuyahoga River. And now we're seeing everybody, especially the Northeast Ohio Sewer District, but the EPA and everybody, they're really working on those creeks. And now, and you would know better than I would, how many of those small creeks flowing into the Cuyahoga River in the Cleveland area have steelhead trout in them? To me, that's magical. I couldn't imagine this happening I still can't imagine that I could go to the old haunts in my neighborhood and in the old Brooklyn neighborhood where there were truck gardens and orchards and things. I still can't imagine that I could have caught steelhead trout in those streams.
Right. I just recently during the COVID and since then, thinking that I should probably learn the Cuyahoga River a little bit better, do some hiking around the tributaries. I walked up the tributaries and everyone had spawning migratory trout or Great Lakes steelhead in them. And I think farther up the system we go, since the dam has been removed now, we're talking about removing the other dam, you're going to see some sustainability. I think it's one of those rivers that you'll actually see fish that'll be hatching and surviving because there's going to be some cooler waters once you get up to Brandywine Creek and, all those furnace runs. So I'm excited. What do you think the general public is going to do now that they have this huge river to start fishing?
I think it's going to slap them up alongside the face because we have polluted that river. I mean, sincerely polluted that river knowingly. Industrial, human waste, everything. We've done it. But we think that was something that recently happened. No, 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 no. No. 200 years ago, almost 200 years ago, two guys opened the first hatchery ever in the United States. And it was on the east side of Cleveland. And the reason they had built that hatchery was that they loved the brook trout. They caught brook trout in their streams around Cleveland, and they were a wonderful fish, and they were great to eat. They were fun to catch, but they disappeared because brook trout are pollution sensitive. They will not survive in a waterway that has any pollution. And so they decided, let's see if we can bring back the brook trout. And they tried for a few years, and they failed miserably because the citizens of Cleveland, the citizens of Northern Ohio, were not about to stop polluting those rivers. Now, we thought the river that burned in '69 was a terrible thing. And Lake Erie was made the mistake on the lake, and everything else was going wrong because of the pollution. But most people didn't realize that wasn't a modern phenomena. A good friend of mine, Dan Egan, wrote the book 3-4 years ago, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. And in his book, after he had written his book, he sent me a review copy because he knew I'd want to read it. And I went right to the pages about the Cuyahoga River, and he talked about the river that burned in '68. And I thought to myself, well, that's wrong. The river burned in '69. We all know it. We saw the pictures. We saw the front page of the Plain Dealer. We saw all that. It was in '69. And then I read on. Dan Egan wasn't writing about 1969. He was writing about 1868.
Oh, my gosh.
So we had 100 years of pollution so bad that oil slicks burned on the Cuyahoga River, and fires broke out about every 20 years until that 1969 fire that was so visible to so many people.
And from there on in, 4 years later, we're here today with steelhead swimming up the rivers, and now we just recently stocked sturgeon up in the upstream of the Cuyahoga. So it's like, it is one of the better comebacks. Think about on the East 9th Street Pier, downtown Cleveland, you are going to have the availability within, if you don't own waders or anything fancy, you're going to have the availability to catch a steelhead from Lake Erie. You don't have to have all the fancy fly gear or any of that. You'll be able to sit down there and enjoy that fishery because it's going to eventually come up the river. You can intercept them off the breakwalls, just like you did at perch back in the days.
Well, if it's a calm day with a south wind, you can take a rowboat out on Lake Erie, and you can put there are so many lures that we can use today, whether it's a diving plug or whatever. You can catch walleye. You can catch steelhead trout from your rowboat if you'd like. And Frank Scalish Sr., who lives on the east side of Cleveland, who fished bass tournaments for a long time and still designs lures for Pradco Lures, one of the major maker of fishing lures. Frank Scalish Sr. introduced me to one of my favorite fishing holes that I had never imagined, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And we fished the shadow of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, rock bass. We caught fish everywhere. And Frank Scalish knew that Cleveland Harbor was one heck of a fishing hole, and you rarely ever see anybody fish it. And here's the thing that we've discovered over the years. When October rolls around, if you want to fish after dark, on the piers, 72nd, 55th Street, Edgewater Park piers, if you want to cast after dark, there's a good chance you're going to catch a walleye.
I would have to agree. And there's not just 10 people, it's hundreds of people.
Exactly.
You know, I'll ask you this. So some rumblings since we've stocked the Cuyahoga River, and the national park doesn't want us to stock them in there to state because it's not a native species. But most of all, they don't want us off their given trails and busting through. Could you enlighten us? Maybe something you've dealt with national parks or something like that. It's like they want us to keep us this little magic and little towpath and these little paths. But the minute any sportsman wants to break free and really enjoy the park, they're like, no, no, no. Is that something you can enlighten us with? Have you any knowledge on that?
They have their ideas of what a national park should be, and it's ridiculous. They don't want exotic species in the Cuyahoga River. Come on now. Give me a break. We have already got exotic species. Go to our federal government today that's just messed up the treatment program that we've got for lamprey eel. You don't want an invasive species in your waters. Well, then you start spending big money to kill lamprey eel because we have invasive species in all our waters. Now, the national park, we have to realize that the Cuyahoga Valley National Park has amazing amounts of deer, white-tailed deer, in their park. And a few years ago, I did a story, and they wouldn't comment on it. I did a story on white-tailed deer starving to death in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park because there's no forage for them there. They were eating the bark off trees, and it wasn't enough sustenance to support them in the wintertime, and they were dying. And I found those critters, and I found that to be happening. Now, the national park, the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, would not do a culling program to make sure that the herd size didn't rise exponentially to be they couldn't handle that. So guess who had to cull the deer herds on an adjacent park? The Cleveland Metro Parks. The Cleveland Metro Parks biologists understood that we can't support that many deer on our Cleveland Metro Parks. So we're going to have to cull deer. There's no doubt about it. And we're going to use sharpshooters, and we're going to do it at night, and we won't offend anybody. But too many deer is going to destroy our park. They'll eat so much that some of them will die pretty soon. So the Metro Parks is doing the culls, but the Cuyahoga Valley National Park wouldn't do it. And it was their responsibility. Their deer, once the Cleveland Metro Parks had thinned the herd in their surrounding parks, the Cuyahoga Valley National Park deer would go into those parks because that's where the food was.
You know, all those stories like that sometimes makes me wonder about the national park system because it's like they're there to help, all the outdoors enthusiasts, right? So it's like I feel the ODNR did a really good job of bucking the system for once because you know how you've been covering the ODNR and you've been keeping them on their toes for 50 years.
Trying to.
Yeah, you try. You're not afraid to push a few buttons. And then you always tell me it's like, it didn't take but like 2 hours after your article hit that somebody from the ODNR or somebody would be like giving you a call just to.
Well, we have to be proud of what the Division of Wildlife and what the Ohio State Parks have done. Ohio State Parks they're really inundated with folks in throughout the summertime. Most of our good inland reservoirs are from their state park reservoirs.
Yeah, I mean, the steelhead program, and we always do some research, their stocking program hats off to Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
They have not missed their goal, even during COVID. They haven't missed their steelhead stocking programs or anything like that. But one fishery that they really haven't had to do much other than manage limits is the walleye boom, right?
Well, we've gone to a 10 fish limit on walleye, and it really didn't work. And there's a really good reason for it, I think, is that if you take and you realize that most of our fishing guides on Lake Erie are 6-pack charters. That means they can take out 6 anglers and the skipper and a first mate, and they can go fish. Now, if you raise the limit to 10 on walleye, the big problem is that you'll have days when the walleye fishing may not be as spectacular as it can be. It may take you pretty much longer to get a limit of fish. And if it goes from 6, which means you're going to have 42 fish on the boat, that's a lot of fish. It's going to go from 42 fish to 66 fish on the boat. So anyway, if you were a charter captain and your clients that day caught the limit of fish, 36 and 6, 42 fish, if they cut those 42 fish, that's enough. If you want to stop keeping fish at a certain time, or you want to really make sure that the fish you catch are the ones you want to keep, that's fine. But your limit should stay at about 36 per day. If you start to get into a situation where you've got 66 fish that you have to catch every day as a charter captain, you're not going to do it. It's going to be far more difficult to come home with a limit of 66 fish than it will be to come home with a limit of 42 fish.
Right. If you would have told me, both of us got our license early in the, early 80s, it was like, I'm catching walleyes on a fly now. It's like, I never would have guessed that, and it's taken a while to figure that game out, but it's like in the midst, with the backdrop of Cleveland in the backdrop. So it's like that fishery is still world class and still is the walleye capital of the world for sure. What about the perch? So there's been some perch declines. What have you heard about the perch? Like, that was our bread and butter, was the perch fishing back in the days. And it was just like you said, you're all night long cleaning little perch with the bottle caps and that. But, it's like, do you think it's going to come back in the Central Basin? Do you think Mother Nature's going to basically rejuvenate itself?
We've seen, we saw in the Western Basin, and that's where I live.
Right.
In the Western Basin, we saw that the Western Basin yellow perch populations 10 years ago went in the tank. They were just difficult to catch, and you're mostly catching small perch, and the head boats were having a real problem. So what the Division of Wildlife put a moratorium on perch, commercial perch fishing. Bingo. Well, they left it on for, I can't remember how many years. It was 4 or 5 years. They left that moratorium on the commercial fishery. And the commercial fishing industry transferred their nets to just about Huron all the way down to the Pennsylvania border. They had that stretch of water to continue to fish. Well, all of a sudden, about 3 or 4 years ago, the yellow perch fishing in the Western Basin not only got to be good, but the people that told us that because of the lack of bait fish in the Western Basin and stuff, that those perch would not grow as large as they do in the Central Basin. Well, these days, the jumbo perch are being caught off Port Clinton, and they're doing really well. The party boat out of Port Clinton, catches 10,000 yellow perch every year now.
Oh, my gosh.
And the people in Fairport Harbor have an abominable perch season. They've had abominable perch seasons for the last few years. And nobody knows exactly what the problem is, but it's a system of management. Now, what we have to say is that the system of managing Lake Erie as a whole has vastly improved since the days when I came on covering Lake Erie and its fishing. Back in the old days, Canada and Ohio could not agree. Ontario and Ohio could not agree on how to share the fish, whether it was walleye or yellow perch or anything. And so if our commercial fishermen overbagged, then the Canadians said, we're going to overbag too, because our commercial fishermen aren't going to be punished because your guys are catching more fish. Well, nowadays, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission has the Lake Erie Committee that takes the fisheries experts from every state and the province of Ontario, and they sit down and they hash out what's good for Lake Erie, the whole lake. Not the Ohio share, which is pretty big, not the Ontario share, which is pretty darn big, but also the Michigan share and the Pennsylvania share and the New York share of Lake Erie. We've got to make sure that the whole lake is viable, and we have to make sure that the populations are maintained of fish. So we have to manage both our commercial fishery and our sport fishery to make that happen.
I think that's across the board, from each coast, from saltwater, the freshwater to inland lakes. Everything is that management, right?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. And there are a lot of different things that we're going to see, I think, happening in the years to come. One of the things that really Cleveland needs to do, and so does the state of Ohio, and so do all the other states. There are a lot of people in this country that don't understand just what we've got. A lot do. A lot of guys that come here, they realize we've got the best walleye fishery in the world. We've got a steelhead trout fishery, a freshwater steelhead trout fishery that nobody else has. We have got a smallmouth bass fishery. I mean, I watched the Gallagher boys out 2 years ago bring in a 10-pound smallmouth bass off the north side of Pelee Island. That is the biggest smallmouth bass ever caught in the Great Lakes. I'm seeing that. And what we don't have sure, we've got a sports committee in Cleveland that promotes sports things happening in Cleveland. It doesn't matter if it's the Special Olympics or it's, any kind of competitions and things like that. They just don't understand fishing. They don't understand a tournament that's being held here. They don't understand any of that. They don't promote it. The state of Ohio, their Department of Tourism, just kind of says, well, fishing's good on Lake Erie. You ought to come here. That's it. Oh boy, they don't promote it. They don't go to a show in South Dakota. They don't go to a show in Nevada. They don't go to a show in Texas and say, hey, you guys want to come to Ohio? You come to Cleveland, Ohio to steelhead trout fish or to walleye fish or to have fun. And guess what we got to show you? We got to show you the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And guess what? We have all the major league sports in Cleveland.
I guess it's not the mistake on the lake, is it?
It's not the mistake on the lake anymore. And thank goodness the Guardians showed everybody in this country last year what an exciting young team they are. And they were so much fun to watch. And the fact was, you could go to a Guardians game, and after the game, you could wander down to 9th Street and cast from the pier and maybe catch a walleye or a steelhead.
It's pretty amazing. Is there anything you'd like to tell the listeners before we start wrapping it up? Do you have any stories or anything that you want to bring up?
Well, what I want to bring up, and it's I get more calls, and I have for the last 40 years, from people that say, I've tried this form of fishing or this form of hunting, and I've really, I haven't been successful, and what do I do? And, in the old days, you just had an uncle that mentored you, or you had a dad, or you had a brother that mentored you and showed you how to do these kind of things. But that's obviously not happening these days. And what I insist that people do is, you're well aware of this, if you've been steelhead trout fishing 4 or 5 times and you've never even hooked a fish and you don't know why you're not catching, why it's not happening, it's because you don't know the things you don't know.
Right.
And so what I suggest, and it's easy to find, get a guide. Go to a fly shop. talk to the people and make sure you got the right gear, make sure you got the right baits, the right flies, all those kinds of things. Back when I started, people that fly fished generally went to truck clubs around the area, and that was it. That was their whole experience. Now, because of guys like you, Jeff, we've got things happening. I fished the upper Rocky River for carp, common carp. It's like bonefish fishing. It's amazing. It's so much fun. You're not going to keep the fish, generally. Some might, but it's one of the best fights you'll ever have in fly fishing. Now, I talked to Jerry Darkus the other day from Strongsville, who's got the really great fly tying book that's just come out again. Jerry is a magician, but he was taking a young lady that ran a fly fishing club down in the Cincinnati area. He was taking her out on Lake Erie, right offshore of Cleveland, and they were catching jumbo sheep's head. And I mean big ones. That's insane. That's fun. And now I'm finding out, and I found it out last year with the catfish, channel catfish in Sandusky Bay. It's insane. They're catching more catfish out of Sandusky. It's like the Red River in Saskatchewan, for God's sake. The Red River has been known around the country as the channel catfish heaven, where you go to catch a 20-pounder. I went to Sandusky Bay last May, and I caught a fish, a channel catfish, with Sam Horn and his charter service. I caught a fish with him that weighed 26 pounds, a channel catfish. He threw it in my lap, and I said, that's the biggest channel catfish I've ever seen. And we did it in about 4 hours of fishing. We caught 47 channel catfish, and I would say 10 of them were over 20 pounds.
I make a living catching catfish on a fly.
And you can do that. And that's what we're going to try this year in May and June. We're going to try the fly fishing for catfish, and I'm sure we can do it.
Oh, absolutely.
And you would know. I mean, look at all the different styles of fishing. But you get to places that I've never fished the rivers of British Columbia. I've fished a little bit of Alaska, but not like you have. I mean, those are some really wonderful areas. And to me, that's what I'd like to experience in the years to come. You know, just once or twice or in my lifetime, go to those kind of fishing holes. And I'd like those people that fish those kind of places to come to Cleveland and see what's happening in an urban area. It's going to stun them.
Right? Urban fishery at its finest. Do you got any last words of wisdom for young writers or any other things you'd like to cover?
Well, you know, the one thing that kind of disturbs me a little bit is that we're becoming too technology oriented. And what brings it to mind is that so many fishermen that I see on Lake Erie, especially the tournament fishermen, are going to forward-facing sonar. And I know it's a great thing. And for people that don't know what I'm talking about, when you use a sonar unit, and I go back to the old green box made by Lowrance Electronics that gave you the depth of the lake you were fishing or the river you were fishing. And, of course, it was fine-tuned to be able so you could see a blip, whether there was a fish down there. And you couldn't tell what size it was or what kind of a fish it was. Well, with forward-facing sonar, what you're doing is you're taking the transducer of your sonar unit and you're pointing it away from your boat horizontally. And you can see a fish 50, 60, 70 feet away. You can see that fish and you know it's a fish. And you know the depth of that fish. And you can cast a lure right to that fish without that fish realizing that there's a boat 100 feet away. And you can set the hook on that fish and catch them. And tournament fishermen are doing that quite often. The bass fishermen are finding that it's really worthwhile. Crappie fishermen are doing it. You know, walleye fishermen in tournaments are doing it. I talked to John Hoyer of Minnesota about that last spring because He told everybody where he was going fishing on Lake Erie on a tournament out of Port Clinton. He told them what he was going to be using. He told everybody that what he was going to do. And then he went out there, but because he is so accomplished in forward-facing sonar, he won the tournament for fun. And he's done that quite a bit in his career. So, I mean, I don't know if we're getting too sophisticated, too electronically sophisticated, and doing things. I don't want to go back to the old green box, even though I have one in my shed and it works.
Well, I think it's been great chatting. Do you have one last story you want to share with us? What was your favorite fishing adventure? What was your most memorable one? You have one at the top of your head?
The strangest and most different fishing trip I took was I was invited by Tourism Canada to go up onto Baffin Island. And it was just unbelievable because you're in the middle of nowhere. It's the fifth biggest island in the world, and only about 2,000 people live there. And they're all shoreline people. There's nobody in the center of the island. And we went to Lake Emajuac, and it was fed by the Mingo River. And the reason we were there was we wanted to see if there were enough trophy Arctic char, and they were landlocked, coming out of the Mingo River and going into Lake Emajuac for tourism to build a lodge there to be run by the Inuit. And, of course, the Inuit Nation now owns Baffin Island. But it was the strangest feeling because I could see a mile. We were camped on Lake Emajuac, and I could see the rising landscape, and I could see about a mile up, and I saw something white moving. And I told the tourism guy who had accompanied us there, we were there for about a week, camped out. We'd come in on a twin otter with Tundra tires and landed on the beach. And he looked at it and he said, "Oh, crap." I said, "What?" He said, "It's a polar bear." He said, "Let's move everything closer to the water and get the boat ready. So if we see that polar bear come anywhere closer, we're out of here. We're jumping in the boat and we're gonna run." And I said, "What?" He said, "You don't understand. Polar bears have never seen people. They know exactly what you are to them. You are food." And I thought, whoa, wait a minute. He said, this isn't like Hudson Bay where you've got places where you can see polar bears and stuff like this. He said, this is the wilderness here. And you are just guests. They live here. And while we were there, a friend of mine and I that were on the trip, he was from Ontario, and we found a pile of rocks that was probably as tall as a kitchen stool. And we looked at it and thought, what the heck is this? And then I realized it was a trapper. It was a trapper that had come that far, and he had killed a caribou, and he had taken the rocks and put it on the parts of the caribou, the legs and the hind quarter and everything. He put rocks on it, and then he'd put traps all around it because the Arctic fox would come in and feed on it. And so we thought, well, that's pretty cool. And then the guy that was with me went over and he saw something, and he went over, and it was a rifle. Oh. And it had been there at least for 50 years. It was covered in patine. It was, you couldn't even open any, the cartridge. You couldn't put a cartridge in it or anything, but it was a rifle. And obviously what it was a trapper was out. He had his rifle. He probably walked away to go fish or do something, and the polar bears arrived, or one of them.
Oh, my goodness.
And we could never find his bones, but we found his trapping rock pile. And a friend of mine who was from Ontario, who was publisher of a paper in southern Ontario, he took the rifle home, and it's on his wall right now because it's a story. It's a story of things happening. And that's the biggest really enjoyment of my job was the stories. There's so many stories. I've been to Costa Rica many times. I've written for Costa Rica Outdoor Magazine, and Jerry Rulo, who was the editor for many, many years, he died about 4 years ago. Jerry Rulo always wanted me to come to Costa Rica to work for his magazine when I retired. And I, you know, I told Jerry, I said, it was great, and I see tourism blossoming down in Costa Rica, and we used to fish Lake Arenal, which is an active volcano, where you would fish the lake, and the lake would tremble every once in a while and kick out some volcanic dust because it was still an active lake, and all the dust would float down on your boat as you were fishing.
That's what we do as anglers and hunters. With
Yes.
Stories, right? And I think regardless of what you catch, what you kill, whatever your goal was, some of the times the best part of the stories is not that part. It's the adventure.
It's the adventure. It's so much fun. And I've hunted and traveled in South Africa. My brother lived there for quite a bit. My older brother, Johnny Mike, he lived in Johannesburg and had a company there doing assembly line equipment. And his wife was from South Africa. She was a model, and they met in Paris when he was there. And they moved to South Africa where she grew up. And, I just love the countryside. Kruger Park with all the critters. I mean, you get elephants and giraffe everywhere. It's just so much fun. In Cape Town, I brought some lures. I called one of my friends at Pratco, and I wanted some of the biggest crankbaits that they had because the fishermen in Cape Town who I was going to fish with asked me if I could find some of them because they couldn't buy them in Europe or in South Africa. So I called Pratco and got a box of them and had them sent to these guys. When I got there, they thought I was a god because I got them lures they couldn't get in their own country. And we went fishing for longfin and yellowfin tuna. And they don't have large fishing boats. They got small fishing boats, and they only have one launch ramp in Cape Town. So we went out fishing one day, and they'd put out about 5 lures, and they'd put one in the prop wash. And they were both in the cabin of the boat eating this greasy sausage the South Africans love to eat. And I'm looking down at that lure fluttering in the water as it was only about 3 feet deep, 4 feet deep, and the water was clear. It was the ocean. And so I'm watching it, and then all of a sudden, something came up. And when I saw it, I was startled. I stepped back, and it was a tuna as long as our boat. And it grabbed that crankbait and turned, and we had short trolling rods, the real heavy-duty short trolling rods with roller guides on them and a 120-pound test line on Penn International reels. And it took the rod tip. You and I couldn't have done this. It took the rod tip and brought it in and hit the water. The rod tip did. I thought the rod was going to break. And that fish ran off about, I'd say, 100 yards of line, and the line, 120-pound test line, snapped. And I thought, holy smokes. So I went up to the cabin with the guys, and I said, hey, guys, you just lost the lure. They said, what? I said, a fish took it. They said, tell us about it. I said, it was longer than your boat. They laughed. And I said, I thought you'd be upset. They said, hey, we'd have never gotten that fish in. Never in 100 years. Just too big. And I thought, oh, my goodness. But, I mean, those are the stories that you get. You know, hitting Kruger Park and hitting some of the game parks and everything. So, you know, the thing that I really enjoyed, too, though, was that when I became the outdoors editor, it introduced me to a whole new line of books that I'd never read, and I do now. And I mean, I love things like Stephen King and Carl Hiaasen, but all the other books, the outdoor books, the old timers, if you ever get a chance, like Robert Rourke and all those great old time writers, hey, you kick back on a Sunday afternoon, put your feet up, have a cup of coffee, and enjoy the outdoors. You'll understand what we're all talking about then.
D'Arcy, I can't thank you enough. for all your knowledge and your stories. And we're going to call this a wrap of this episode. Maybe we'll get D'Arcy back again and chat some more. It's just the wealth of knowledge and the stories and the memories are something I enjoy. I hope you enjoyed, the listeners enjoyed it. And if you ever have a chance, check out cleveland.com. D'Arcy still does the fishery reports on Fridays, and he does a little ghost writing here and there. Might not be his name, but if you have any questions, reach out to me personally at Great Lakes Dude or Dave at Wet Fly Swing. Thanks for the listen, and we'll be catching you on the next episode.
That is a wrap. You can grab all of the show notes at wetflyswing.com. And please follow us on Instagram and share this episode out with someone you love. Please send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com, if you have any feedback or want us to put together an episode on this podcast for you. Check in anytime. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and would love to meet up with you on the water. We have new fly fishing schools going all year long and all around the country, so if you want to connect, let's do it right now. All right, time to get out of here. I hope you have a great evening. I hope you have a great morning or great afternoon wherever in the world you are, and I appreciate you for stopping by and checking out the show today. We'll talk to you soon.